March 1944, Northern Germany. The morning began with a silence that didn't feel like peace. It was the kind that followed exhaustion, the kind that settles on men who've seen too much sky burn. The frost still clung to the edges of the rail tracks outside Rechlin-Lärz, the Luftwaffe's hidden heart, where science met desperation in the final months of the Reich. Every breath that morning looked like smoke, and every sound, the hiss of steam, the metallic groan of brakes, seemed too loud for what the war had become. At 6:20, a freight train rolled into the airfield siding. It wasn't supposed to. Rechlin didn't welcome visitors, only secrets. The guards watched in silence as the black locomotive halted beside Hangar 2, the same hangar whose walls still bore pockmarks from a British raid weeks earlier. From the flat car, under torn tarps and mud-caked ropes, came a shape that looked less like a wreck and more like a question. Men in oil-stained overcoats gathered as the tarps were pulled away. What emerged was no German aircraft, not a Focke-Wulf, not a Messerschmitt, not even the stubby shape of a captured Spitfire. It was something sleeker, something alien. The sunlight, weak and colorless, slid across its silver fuselage and dull red markings, catching on the smooth curve of its wing. The letters still visible on the tail read, P-51. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then someone whispered, "Englisher?" A voice behind him answered, low and almost reverent, "Amerikanisch." The name spread like smoke. Mustang. The pilot hadn't survived. His body had been recovered near Brandenburg 2 days earlier, still strapped to his parachute, half buried in a frozen field. The papers in his flight jacket said Lieutenant Harold E. James, 355 Fighter Group, Debden Airfield. His maps, still folded beside the throttle quadrant, told the rest. A route from England to Berlin and back. Impossible. Everyone knew that distance. Nearly 1,100 miles. No single-engine fighter could cross the North Sea, escort bombers over the capital, fight, and return. The Luftwaffe's best estimate placed Allied fighter range at 450 miles, 500 at most. Anything beyond that was bomber heaven. That was why they'd built the flak belts, the radar nets, the night fighter corridors. Berlin was supposed to be safe from the reach of such machines. And yet, here it was, an American fighter that had made it that far before dying. Colonel Hermann von Bombach, the director of the Technical Intelligence Service, arrived within the hour. He was tall, gaunt, the kind of man whose uniform always seemed to hang on a mind faster than his body. The others called him Der Denker, the thinker, half out of respect, half out of unease. He didn't salute the wreck. He studied it. "Get it inside," he said, "before the snow ruins what's left." The cranes lifted the aircraft gently, almost tenderly. The wheels still turned. The propeller was bent but intact. The nose bore streaks of burnt oil. The canopy had cracked open on impact, but the cockpit instruments remained strangely untouched. By the time they rolled it into the hangar, the sunlight had faded to that cold gray the Germans called Kriegslicht, war light, the kind that made everything look like it was already part of history. Inside, the engineers worked like priests around a relic. They cleaned mud off the wings, traced bullet holes, and sketched the contours of its frame on drafting paper. The hangar smelled of acetone, rubber, and fear. Someone switched on the overhead lamps, and the silver skin of the P-51 seemed to glow faintly against the gloom. One mechanic whispered, "It's beautiful." Another spat on the floor. So was the Titanic. Bombach didn't react. He removed his gloves and placed his bare hand on the cold metal of the left wing. His palm came away stained with dirt and oil, but his eyes didn't leave the surface. "This flew from England?" he asked quietly. "According to the maps, yes, Herr Oberst." "And back?" "The pilot didn't make it back." "Still," he murmured, "he made it here." That was the problem. The Mustang wasn't supposed to be here at all. At the edge of the hangar, a young flight engineer named Schaefer climbed up the wing and looked into the cockpit. The glass was fogged with dried condensation. Inside, the controls looked almost civilized compared to the German designs, ergonomic, precise, stripped of clutter. Even the gun sight seemed cleaner, sleeker. The radio set had English markings that none of them could read. Schaefer adjusted the seat and found a small metal plate bolted under the left console. North American Aviation, Incorporated. Inglewood, California. He mouthed the words like a prayer. California. For him, it might as well have been another planet. Baumbach walked around the aircraft slowly, his boots clicking on the concrete. He paused at the wings, noting their strange, semi-elliptical curve. "This is not like the Spitfire," he said. "Look at the sweep, the taper." He tapped the aluminum skin with a gloved knuckle. Light, but strong. A technician with a clipboard noted the material thickness, 1.3 millimeters, then added quietly, "We couldn't afford aluminum this pure since 1942. They removed the engine cowling next. Beneath it lay a sight that made the mechanics whistle under their breath. A Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. But not quite. Stamped on its side were the words Packard 51650-7, a license-built version made in Detroit. It gleamed with the polish of industrial abundance. Every line symmetrical, every fitting machined to tolerances German factories could no longer match. They turned the propeller shaft. It spun smoothly, effortlessly. "American production," Baumbach said, half to himself. "They build them like clocks." He leaned closer to the carburetor and whispered, almost in disbelief, "And they have enough to lose one." For the rest of that day, the team documented everything. Wingspan, fuselage length, fuel lines, radio channels, oxygen tanks. Each measurement chipped away at an illusion they had believed in for years, that Germany's technological superiority could outweigh America's industry. At dusk, as the light drained from the windows, Baumbach stood alone beside the Mustang. The others had gone for dinner, leaving him in the echoing space with the quiet hum of cooling metal. He lit a cigarette, inhaled deeply, and stared at the machine as if waiting for it to confess. He thought of all the pilots he had briefed. Brave, exhausted boys sent up against bombers they could barely reach. He thought of Galland, his friend, complaining that Allied escorts now chased them all the way to Magdeburg. He had dismissed it as exaggeration. Now, looking at the P-51, he wasn't so sure. If this aircraft truly flew from England to Berlin, then the Reich had already lost its last sanctuary, the sky above its heart. That night, the airfield slept under blackout curtains, but inside Hangar 2, the Mustang didn't rest. Under the lamps, its surface reflected tiny points of light like stars trapped beneath its skin. A guard posted outside swore he could hear it ticking, the sound of cooling metal, expanding and contracting, like a heartbeat refusing to die. He wrote later in his diary, "It looked alive, as if waiting for someone to fly it home. By morning, the snow had melted enough for the ground crew to tow the aircraft fully inside the evaluation hall. The great wooden doors shut behind them with a sound like the end of an era. They would soon begin their examination, measuring, testing, disassembling. But for now, there was only the silence of men standing before something that changed the rules of war." Baumbach stood at the front, his breath visible in the cold air. His officers waited for orders. He said only 5 words. "Find out how far it flew." No one knew then that the answer would reveal not just the range of an airplane, but the reach of an entire civilization. The air smelled faintly of oil and ink as pens began scratching across clipboards. Somewhere, a photographer's flash went off, briefly washing the silver aircraft in white light. For that fraction of a second, the P-51 looked new again. as if reborn, shimmering with the quiet arrogance of American design. And then the light faded, leaving behind only the echo of that impossible flight. In the days that followed, they would learn things no bullet could teach. They would learn about tanks made of paper, engines made by factories that never slept, and a way of fighting that turned waste into strategy. But on that first day, in that hangar where frost met steel and pride met reality, they learned the most painful lesson of all, that victory doesn't belong to the bravest, but to the busiest. And as the generator's hum filled the air, Colonel Bombach turned once more to the wrecked fighter and whispered to himself, softly, like a confession no one was meant to hear, "They've built a war we cannot catch." The first thing they did was measure the impossible. Inside the drafty evaluation hall, under flickering sodium lamps and the smell of oil and cold iron, the Luftwaffe's engineers began taking the Mustang apart the way a coroner studies a body. Gently, reluctantly, but with curiosity sharpened by fear. Every inch of the silver skin was mapped, every fuel line traced, every rivet logged. The sound of pencils scratching against clipboards became a kind of nervous music. By noon, the hangar looked like a laboratory of quiet disbelief. The aircraft stood stripped of its panels, its belly exposed, wings open like a crucifix under dissection. The men moved slowly, deliberate, like priests before a relic they did not understand. "Fuselage tank," murmured Schaefer, noting the numbers. 85 gallons. Another voice from the wing section. "Each wing tank, 92. Someone tapped on a blackboard and added the total. 269 gallons. They stared at the figure as if expecting it to change. At 70 gallons an hour, that meant maybe 3.5 hours of flight time. 4 if the pilot was gentle on the throttle. It wasn't enough. Even accounting for wind, for altitude, for engine efficiency, the math was unforgiving. It couldn't have made it to Berlin. It couldn't have made it back. And yet, it had. The debate that followed lasted 2 days. They argued over drag coefficients, air density, propeller pitch, even the purity of American fuel. The engineers' blackboards filled with equations that looped like spiderwebs, tangled with frustration. Numbers didn't lie, but the wreck outside did. On the second night, fatigue turned to irritation. One officer slammed his notebook shut. "Perhaps the pilot was mad," he muttered. "He didn't plan to return." Another older man shook his head. "Then why the maps? Why mark the return route?" Bombach listened from the edge of the room, hands behind his back, eyes unreadable. He didn't speak until the arguments collapsed into silence. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "either our mathematics are wrong, or the Americans are not flying mathematics." The next morning brought no answers, only more confusion. A mechanic had drained the remaining fuel from the tanks overnight, filtering it into glass jars for analysis. It smelled different, cleaner, sharper, almost sweet. Aviation 100 octane, someone identified. The Americans called it purple fuel. They'd heard rumors of it for months. Gasoline so refined it made engines run hotter, faster, longer. They measured the octane rating with improvised equipment. The result came back, 115. The room fell quiet. Germany's best fuel that winter was 87. The difference wasn't just chemistry. It was civilization. Still, even with their miracle fuel, the range didn't add up. Bombach paced the hangar floor, boots echoing off concrete. "There's something we're missing," he said. "A connection, a mechanism, something external." That word hung in the air. External. At 14:10 that day, an apprentice mechanic named Lenz, barely 20, crawled under the wing to scrub off the mud that clung to the underside. His wire brush caught on something, a stub of twisted metal protruding near the wing root. It looked like a broken pipe, sheared clean by impact. He leaned closer. The opening was circular, threaded. He called out, "Herr Oberst!" "Come see this." The others crowded around. Flashlights clicked on. There it was, a small, torn-off coupling leading nowhere. The engineers froze. "What does it connect to?" someone asked. Lenz shrugged. "Nothing. It ends here." "No," said Baumbach slowly. "It begins here." They traced the line inward, through the wing skin, across a valve assembly, into the main fuel system. It was designed to transfer fuel from an external source, a source that was now missing. For the first time, someone said the words aloud. "Jettisonable tanks." The room buzzed like a live wire. If the Americans had found a way to carry extra fuel in detachable pods and discard them mid-flight, that would explain everything. But why hadn't they found any wreckage? No aluminum fragments, no spare fittings, nothing. Because, they reasoned, whatever had fallen away might not have been metal at all. That night, as snow began falling again outside, the search orders went out. Every Luftwaffe command post across Brandenburg and Mecklenburg received identical telegrams stamped Geheime Kommandosache. Top secret. Greater than report. Immediately, any discovery of unfamiliar fuel containers or light alloy structures near crash or combat sites involving American aircraft. Retrieve intact specimens if possible. By dawn, the countryside was crawling with search parties. Hitler youth in brown coats, farmers, engineers, even soldiers on leave. They combed frozen fields, ditches, and forest clearings for anything that didn't belong. The war had turned them into scavengers of genius. At Rechlin, the days passed in tense waiting. The engineers worked through the nights, dissecting every corner of the Mustang's design. They found little details that made them feel smaller by the hour. Electrical connectors labeled with color codes instead of serial numbers. Maintenance notes stamped with cartoons. Bolts identical in every position, standardized for assembly line speed. "Even their mistakes," muttered one inspector, "are efficient." Baumbach didn't answer. He sat at his desk, reviewing intercepted Allied transmissions. His pencil tapped slowly against the paper. His eyes were shadowed by sleeplessness. He wasn't thinking about the airplane anymore. He was thinking about the people who built it. He had once believed, like many in the Luftwaffe, that German skill could triumph over American quantity. But this machine had changed that equation. This wasn't a product of improvisation. It was the output of a nation that had made organization its weapon. 3 days after the discovery of the broken pipe, the first call came in. A rural police unit near Wittenberg reported that a farmer had found strange silver debris scattered across his field after an air battle. Lightweight, cylindrical, with faint blue markings. Within hours, a truck carrying 2 battered objects arrived at Rechlin. They were 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, dented but largely intact. The surface was painted dull gray, but beneath the scratches, something pale showed through. When the cranes lowered one onto a wooden table, it made a hollow, papery sound. The engineers gathered around. Someone fetched a saw. The first cut was hesitant. A thin blade pressed against the shell. It didn't screech like aluminum. It whispered. Fibers peeled back, curling at the edges, releasing a faint chemical odor. A second cut deepened the opening. A flap came loose. And then, disbelief. It wasn't metal at all. The interior glistened with a lacquered coating. The structure underneath looked layered. Sheets upon sheets of dense paper pressed and glued together. Inside, wooden ribs supported the walls, and thin brass fittings marked where the fuel line had once connected. The air smelled of gasoline and resin. "Paper," someone whispered. Another corrected him. "No, pulp." Kraft paper Baumbach stepped closer, running his hand along the rough, fibrous edge. The paper was thick, rigid, coated with varnish. He looked up at his officers and spoke quietly, almost to himself. "They are flying to Berlin, with tanks made of paper." No one laughed. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the overhead lamps. Then, one by one, the engineers began to understand. The missing link, the extra range, the contradiction that had haunted their calculations for days. The Mustang hadn't carried a miracle engine or impossible math. It had carried a disposable secret, something so light, so absurdly simple, that no one in Rechlin had even imagined it. They weren't just fighting airplanes anymore. They were fighting an idea. That night, as the snow fell heavier outside, the men gathered in the canteen. They drank weak beer and spoke in low voices. Some were angry, others just tired. "They make fuel tanks out of paper," one said bitterly, "and we still hand machine ours from aluminum." Another stared into his cup. "They have more aluminum than we have paper." A third laughed hollowly. "Maybe they've found a way to win wars by recycling." Bombach said nothing. He simply stood at the window, watching the snow blur the outlines of the hangars. He realized that the Americans weren't improvising out of shortage. They were innovating out of surplus. They weren't forced into cleverness. They had chosen efficiency as a philosophy, and that was something no amount of bravery or engineering pride could overcome. When he finally returned to his office past midnight, he found the paper tank fragment lying on his desk. Someone had written a note beside it. "Unzerstörbar durch Denken." Unconquerable by thought. He stared at it for a long time, then blew out the lamp. In the darkness, the faint chemical scent lingered in the air. The smell of glue and gasoline, of something cheap and temporary that had already rewritten the future. Outside, the frozen rails gleamed under moonlight, waiting for the next train that would bring the next surprise. But for Bombach, the war had changed forever. He had seen the truth inside paper. The snow in Brandenburg melted slowly that March, leaving behind a landscape of mud and rumors. Villages that had spent 4 years pretending not to see the war suddenly found themselves part of it in the strangest way. Not through bombs or soldiers, but through scavengers looking for paper. Orders had gone out under sealed envelopes stamped Geheim Kommandosake. The message was simple. Greater than. Report immediately any discovery of cylindrical containers, non-metallic, possibly fuel-related. Deliver intact to Rechlin Technical Center. It was the kind of order no one understood, but everyone obeyed. Children searched the ditches on their way to school. Farmers walked their fields with shovels instead of plows. Railway workers inspected embankments for debris instead of rails. And through it all, the word spread. The Americans were dropping something strange. Not bombs, not parachutes. Something that fell gently, silently, and burned like paper soaked in gasoline. At Rechlin, Colonel von Bombach read each report as if piecing together a ghost. He smoked more now, his desk covered with ash, his coat smelling of turpentine and sleep. Every telegram carried fragments of disbelief. Found light tank near Wittenberge. Appears wooden, cylinder recovered near Neustrelitz. Smells of fuel. Object disintegrated when lifted. Material resembles cardboard. By the end of the week, 2 examples arrived that had survived impact. They were dented, filthy, but whole enough to tell a story. The crates that held them were marked Vorsicht, nicht Feuer, caution, no fire. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The engineers wheeled the first tank onto a steel table under the examination lamps. It looked almost absurdly light. 6 feet long, gray-green paint flaking off in strips. The metal hooks at its nose were bent outward, the tail end crushed where it had hit the ground. When they set it down, the sound wasn't the sharp ring of aluminum. It was a dull thud, like tapping on wood. One of the men laughed nervously. "They've built their war from toys." No one joined him. Schaefer fetched a hacksaw, the kind used in model workshops. He cut along the seam while the others leaned in. The blade bit through easily. Too easily. A sweet chemical smell filled the air, like varnish mixed with fuel. The shell peeled open in layers, curling back at the edges like parchment under flame. Inside, beneath the lacquer sheen, lay the unmistakable texture of pressed paper. 12 sheets thick, darkened by resin, reinforced with thin wooden ribs. "Mein Gott," whispered someone. "It's papier." Baumbach ran his fingers along the cross-section, feeling the roughness give way to smooth lacquer. He didn't speak. For months he had measured despair in tons of steel and liters of fuel. Now it came in grams of pulp. They examined the fittings. Brass valves, lightweight couplers, rubber gaskets. All standardized, all perfect. No handmade improvisations, no shortages betrayed. The Americans hadn't built these in aircraft factories. They could have been made in a furniture plant, a packaging mill, even a school workshop. The thought chilled him. "Do you see?" he said quietly. "They can build these anywhere. Anyone can build these." The second tank confirmed it. It bore a faded stencil, a N-M 64108 GALAUXFUEL. The paint was chipped, but the meaning clear. Auxiliary, detachable, disposable. The technicians drained the last syrup of gasoline from inside. It shimmered with rainbow film across the concrete floor. Schaefer, who had once believed himself an engineer of precision, stared at it like a man watching his profession dissolve. "They use paper," he muttered. "We use genius." Baumbach corrected him softly. "They use freedom." That evening, a storm rolled over the airfield. Wind rattled the hangar doors, scattering papers and blueprints like frightened birds. Inside, the men worked under lanterns as lightning flickered through the cracks in the roof. Every flash turned the paper tanks ghost white, glowing like apparitions of the future. One mechanic joked that the Americans had invented Fliegende Zeitung, flying newspapers. No one laughed, because by then, even the slowest among them had realized what these things truly meant. They weren't clever gadgets. They were proof of something far larger, a system, a mindset, a way of fighting that treated material not as treasure, but as time. Time saved was victory earned. Germany still built machines the way artists painted, meticulously, expensively, perfectly. America built them the way rain falls, endlessly, indifferently, until everything is wet. The following morning, a courier from Berlin arrived with urgent instructions. The Air Ministry demanded a full report for Göring himself. They wanted technical drawings, chemical analysis, manufacturing feasibility, anything that might let the Reich reproduce the technology. Baumbach read the request and laughed for the first time in months. "Tell them," he said, "to start by finding 1,000,000 gallons of paper." The laughter didn't last. He spent the rest of the day dictating notes, density of laminated kraft sheets, tensile strength after resin curing, possible substitutes, phenolic compounds, bakelite coatings. It was all theater. Germany had neither the raw material nor the time. Even if they could copy the design, they couldn't copy the principle behind it. The willingness to make something cheap, temporary, and good enough. The Reich still worshipped permanence. America worshipped throughput. By late spring, reports multiplied. Farmers kept bringing in more debris. Some charred, some waterlogged, some half-buried in snow. One old woman near Ludwigslust told a soldier that the sky had begun to shed its skin. She wasn't wrong. Children collected the fragments as souvenirs. They painted them, turned them into sleds, even used them as roofing. A strange new artifact had entered German life, something fragile yet untouchable, both enemy and miracle. The very lightness of it mocked the heavy world collapsing around them. In the main hangar, Bombach ordered the tanks hung from the ceiling by wires. When the lamps burned through the night, their thin shadows stretched across the walls like wings. He wanted his men to look at them every morning before work, a reminder of what they were up against. He started keeping a diary then. In one entry he wrote, "They say we fight for survival. Perhaps they fight for momentum. I used to believe quality would defeat quantity. Now I see that quantity is a quality, one we never learned." He underlined the last sentence twice. Weeks passed. The front lines crept closer to the Reich's borders. The sound of Allied bombers became as regular as weather. Every few days, Bombach would step outside during raids and watch the contrails. Hundreds of them, weaving across the gray sky. For every bomber, he counted 2, sometimes 3 Mustangs. They flew higher, faster, longer than logic allowed. And somewhere above, invisible against the sun, more paper tanks fell toward the fields below. One afternoon, he found a fragment caught in the barbed wire fence outside the compound, a thin curve of laminated paper no larger than his hand. He turned it over in the light and noticed something faintly embossed beneath the paint. Property of U.S. Army Air Forces. He slipped it into his pocket and carried it for the rest of the war. By summer, the countryside was littered with evidence. Crushed tanks glistening in ditches, villagers burning them for heat, school teachers using the intact ones to collect rainwater. Even the crows had learned to recognize the shapes, circling them for warmth as sunlight reflected off their lacquered skins. To the people below, the paper tanks became a kind of weather omen. When they fell, it meant the bombers weren't far behind. Children would point upward and say, "Der Himmel verliert Papier." The sky is losing paper. At Rechlin, the phrase took on darker meaning. For the men who had built their faith on machinery, it meant something else entirely. The sky wasn't losing paper. It was losing them. On the last day of March, Bombach gathered his team in the hangar. The wind outside carried the first smell of thaw. He stood beside the disassembled Mustang, its wings stripped bare, its body surrounded by the relics of their discovery. 2 paper tanks, a blackboard of equations, a pile of broken pride. He looked at his men, engineers, mechanics, chemists, men who once believed they were the cutting edge of the modern world. Now they stood like archaeologists of a future already built somewhere else. "Gentlemen," he said, "the Americans have done something we did not think possible. They've made fuel from pulp, wings from patience, and range from rubbish. Do not be ashamed. Learn from it." He paused, then added quietly, "We are witnessing the industrial future. And it isn't ours." No one applauded. The words simply hung there, absorbed by the cold air, by the silent machine that had brought them truth. Outside, somewhere beyond the clouds, another formation of bombers crossed the sky, escorted always by silver fighters that never seemed to tire, their discarded paper ghosts fluttering down like snow. And in that moment, every man at Rechlin understood. The war was already lost, not on the battlefield, but in the factories where men learned to turn imagination into mass production. By summer 1944, the paper had conquered the sky. What began as a curiosity on a workbench at Rechlin became a signature of apocalypse visible from every German village. The contrails appeared first, long white scars etching across the blue, the way chalk lines mark a condemned building. Then came the sound, a slow, layered thunder that rolled over fields and towns, over church spires and factory chimneys, over the graves of all the illusions men like Bombach had once believed in. When villagers looked up, they saw the impossible. Silver dots escorting the bombers all the way to Berlin, Munich, even Silesia, the deep heartland once thought untouchable. They watched them dive and climb, attack and vanish, still circling long after the bombers turned home. Einmotorig, the people whispered in disbelief. Single-engine fighters. In offices and bunkers, officers demanded explanations. How could one-engine machines fly 600 miles beyond their limits and still return? The reports from Rechlin provided the answer, and made things worse. Paper auxiliary tanks enable extended escort range of Mustang fighters beyond 1,500 kilometers. The sentence looked innocent on the page, but between those words lay the death warrant of 1,000 German pilots. At Luftwaffe headquarters, maps once covered with red lines marking safety radii were erased. There were no safe zones now, but to every Luftwaffe crewman who saw them fall, it felt like watching the sky shed victory one tank at a time, because they knew each one meant another fighter had reached home. Civilians began calling them Himmelfässer, heaven barrels. Children used them as sleds in the snow that winter. They would climb inside, pretending to be pilots, unaware they were playing inside the most efficient death machine ever built. At night, Baumbach would sometimes walk to the hangar and look at the empty space where the Mustang had once stood. The air still smelled faintly of oil and resin. He thought about the American engineers, men he'd never met, working under electric lights somewhere in Detroit or Inglewood. Men who probably never held a weapon yet had changed the war more than any general. He imagined them leaving their factories at dusk, tired but unafraid, knowing their work would cross oceans and end empires. It wasn't hate he felt toward them anymore. It was envy. Envy for their distance from the destruction they created. He envied, too, their certainty. In September, an intercepted Allied broadcast reached Rechlin through a broken radio relay. It was a propaganda piece from London, boasting that American fighters now accompany our bombers all the way to Berlin and back, thanks to extended-range fuel systems. The engineers listened in silence. No one translated the rest. They didn't need to. When the transmission ended, Krauss turned to Baumbach and said, "So it's official." Baumbach nodded slowly. "Yes, the sky belongs to paper." The next morning, he stood outside as another formation passed overhead. A river of silver across a blue so wide it made him dizzy. He wondered how many of those fighters carried the same tanks they had once examined. How many would jettison them over some distant field? How many of those paper shells would tumble down to earth like messages no one would ever read? The thought should have made him bitter. Instead, it filled him with a strange peace. There was a purity to it, an elegance in defeat when it came so simply explained. He watched until the last speck vanished, then whispered to no one, "They've found a way to make war disposable." And for the first time, the words didn't sound like surrender. They sounded like prophecy. By autumn, the world beneath those silver wings had changed beyond repair. The factories that once built Messerschmitts now made coffins. The rail lines that had carried raw aluminum to the front now carried refugees. And still the paper tanks kept falling. Silent, hollow, weightless reminders that somewhere, a different kind of nation was writing the next chapter of history, one disposable page at a time. April 1945. The war that once filled the air with engines had fallen into whispers and ashes. The front was collapsing from every direction, and Rechlin, once the crown jewel of the Luftwaffe's scientific ambition, was now a ruin of unfinished experiments and burnt files. The air smelled of resin, dust, and resignation. The runways were cracked, the hangars half empty, and the men who had once built the Reich's future now waited only for someone to come and take it from them. Colonel Hermann von Baumbach had stopped wearing rank insignia. There was no one left to salute him, and no orders worth obeying. For weeks, he had been burning documents, blueprints, photographs, flight records, everything except one file. Inside that folder were sketches of the Mustang, notes on the paper tanks, and a small piece of laminated kraft sheet polished smooth by his thumb. The last relic of the moment he realized the war was lost. When the Americans finally arrived, there was no resistance. The soldiers who entered Rechlin expected a fortress of secrets. What they found looked more like a museum of exhaustion. Laboratories covered in dust, engines half disassembled, chalkboards filled with equations no one had erased. A few engineers stood waiting beside their work tables as if still expecting orders. In the main hall, 2 American officers paused before the paper tanks that hung from the ceiling. They didn't know they were looking at the artifact that had once broken the Reich's confidence. One of them reached out, tapped the shell, and laughed softly. "Hell," he said. "We used to make these by the thousands." Baumbach watched from the shadows. He had spent months imagining this moment, trying to decide what defeat would feel like. It didn't feel like shame. It felt like gravity, inevitable, impersonal, final. He stepped forward and introduced himself in fluent English. The taller of the 2 officers nodded. "You ran this place?" "I tried to understand what you built," Baumbach replied. "I never finished." They asked him about jets, rockets, radar. He answered politely, but when one of them mentioned the Mustang, he stopped them with a raised hand. "The airplane didn't win the war," he said quietly. "The factory did." Weeks later, Allied intelligence gathered the engineers of Rechlin for debriefing. They expected confessions about secret weapons, but what they received were lessons. The Germans spoke not of V-2 rockets or jet engines, but of resin, paper, and production lines. They described the day they had sliced open the American tank, how they had felt the fibers beneath their fingers and known the war's balance had shifted. One young interrogator, barely 20, seemed confused. "You're telling me," he said, "you lost faith because of a fuel tank?" Baumbach met his eyes. "Not because of it. Because of what it meant. It meant that your people could turn the ordinary into victory, that you could make even waste work for you. We built monuments. You built methods." The room fell silent. The translator hesitated, unsure whether to render the last word. Methodin. He wrote it down anyway. Months later, Baumbach found himself in an American camp near Heidelberg, where former scientists were interviewed for potential relocation. One afternoon, a colonel from the U.S. Army Air Forces sat with him over weak coffee. The colonel had a folder labeled Operation Lusty, the code name for collecting enemy technology. "I read your report," the American said, "about the drop tanks. It's fascinating." Baumbach smiled faintly. "It's simple." "Sometimes that's the same thing," the colonel replied. He asked whether the Germans had tried to copy them. "We did," said Baumbach. "But we couldn't copy your economy." The colonel nodded. "You know, we're already moving past paper. Aluminum's cheap again. Plastics are coming." Baumbach looked out the window at the gray sky. "Then it never ends." The colonel shrugged. "That's the point." After the war, many of Rechlin's engineers were absorbed into new lives, some in American laboratories, others in British universities. A few vanished into Soviet research centers east of the Elbe. But wherever they went, they carried the same memory. The shock of touching that paper tank for the first time, the sudden awareness that genius alone could no longer win a war. In Dayton, Ohio, 2 years later, a group of former Luftwaffe scientists lectured at Wright Field. They stood before a room of young American engineers and spoke of design philosophy, not ideology. One of them, gray-haired, stiff, eyes tired but alert, drew a circle on the chalkboard and said in a German accent, "This is not material. This is mindset," he wrote beneath it. "Design for manufacturability." The phrase would later appear in engineering textbooks across the world, stripped of its origin in defeat. Decades passed. Rechlin became a museum. Tourists walked through the reconstructed hangars, reading plaques about test flights and prototypes. In one glass case sat the relics of the American discovery. 2 drop tanks, their lacquer cracked, their paper layers visible where time had peeled away the silver paint. Most visitors glanced at them briefly before moving on to the jets and rockets. Few understood that those fragile shells had once defined the edge of human progress. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, a curator would tap the tank lightly with his knuckle and smile at the dull, woody sound. "It doesn't look like much," he'd tell students, "but this," he would say, "is what victory feels like. Light, disposable, efficient." In the archives, the papers of Colonel von Bombach survive. Between sketches and equations are fragments of something else, philosophy disguised as notes. One reads, "Greater than, the American secret was not invention. It was iteration." Another, written in the final days before surrender. "Greater than I once believed permanence was proof of greatness. Now I know greatness is the ability to replace oneself faster than one can be destroyed." He never wrote another report after that. He died in 1952, teaching mechanical design at a small university in Stuttgart. His students remembered him as kind, meticulous, and strangely reverent toward the simplest solutions. When asked about the war, he would only say, "I learned from paper." Today, in quiet museums and storage depots, a few of those tanks remain. Their surfaces are brittle, the lacquer yellowed by time, the brass fittings dull with corrosion. Curators keep them under low light, afraid that brightness itself might break them. And yet, they endure. Fragile monuments to a paradox. That the most disposable thing built in that war outlived the empire that sought to understand it. In one corner of the Smithsonian storage facility, far from the public galleries, a single tank rests on a steel rack. Its label is almost unreadable. Auxiliary fuel container, P-51 Mustang, 108 gallons laminated paper. Dust softens its edges, and when light falls through the window, it glows faintly, like parchment backlit by memory. If you lean close, you can still see the grain of the paper, the faint fingerprints of the men who built it in some factory across the ocean in 1943. Men who never flew, never fought, but who, with pulp and glue and time, quietly changed the course of the world. The Second World War ended not only on the battlefields, but in the factories, in the quiet spaces where machines outproduced ideology. In those final years, Germany's engineers at Rechlin discovered something that changed their understanding of modern warfare. An American fuel tank made not from aluminum or steel, but from laminated paper and resin. It carried 108 gallons of fuel, and with it, carried a new philosophy. That victory belonged to those who could turn raw material into results faster than their enemies could understand it. The paper drop tank was not an accident of improvisation. It was a deliberate act of industrial intelligence. A design born from abundance, not scarcity. It allowed the P-51 Mustang to escort bombers across the heart of Germany to Berlin and back, ending the Luftwaffe's last illusion of safety. When the war ended, captured German engineers spoke less about secret weapons and more about that moment, the day they touched a paper tank and realized the war's outcome was already written in the language of production. Many of them later worked in American laboratories, teaching the same lesson they had learned through defeat. That simplicity, scalability, and speed had replaced the old gods of craftsmanship and perfection. Today, a few of those tanks survive in museums, their lacquer cracked, their kraft paper layers visible beneath fading silver paint. Visitors often walk past them, unaware that these fragile shells once represented one of the most powerful ideas of the 20th century. That the future would belong not to those who built the strongest machines, but to those who built them fast enough to change history. The war that began with steel ended with paper. The men who believed in permanence were overtaken by those who believed in production. And somewhere, in that thin line between fragility and power, the modern age was born. Under the dim museum light, one such tank still rests quietly. Its surface glints faintly, reflecting the shape of a man who is no longer there. It wasn't built to last, but it outlived the empire that tried to understand it.